Like, yeah, like I said, I am a big proponent of public involvement. I want the public to know that we do more than launch missiles out there. And also to educate people about the Cape, because the Cape was not built to put men in space. It was built to test rockets and missiles for delivering nuclear warheads to the Soviet Union. The manned space program happened later. And basically what they did was they took a capsule and put it on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile and put a human in there and shot them up into space. So they're basically riding a big Roman candle back in the day. And so the AFMAN, the Air Force Manual, and the Department of Defense and instruction states we need to promote public access. So how do I work that in? So in 2016, I came up with this grand program. I didn't call it C-Camp at the time. It was just basically a way to get students, universities, and the public involved, engaged, and at the same time, do compliance and mitigate adverse effects. So I approached the Department of Anthropology at UCF and said, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you come out here and do archaeology with me? And this is how it's going to work. You know, the students provide the free slave labor, right? So I use them and abuse them, but the money, main part of the money goes to doing all the latest type of analysis that you can do on artifacts, et cetera, at the sites. So we're talking about optical thermoluminescent dating, all kinds of ceramic analysis and everything. So we can go to the regulators and say, guess what? We cannot save these sites, but we are putting together the most comprehensive report ever done on these sites with all the latest technology. So we're taking all the ACI stuff, all their notes and all their reports and data, incorporating it. Janus Research, New South Associates, et cetera. Everybody that's worked back there before my arrival, we're bringing that data in with all the new data. So we decided to do a test season in 2017. So we divided our time between the old lighthouse site and the burn site. And part of the reason why we have two sites going on at the time is the burn site is on the south side of Fuel Storage Area 1 where they process hydrogen and oxidizer, and it's in the toxic vapor corridor. So we can only work there certain days. So we would split time so everybody stayed working in the field, and plus both sites needed to be analyzed. Next slide. Okay, so the program, C-Camp, when I finally came up with that great acronym, right, not hard to figure out, is it had to support the Space Force, Air Force, and the mission. What is the mission? Launching space vehicles, research and development of space vehicles, supporting launch customers, doing war fighting. Okay, it had to be compliant and involve mitigation, had to comply with the regulations of the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, National Historic Preservation Act, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, to name a few, and it had to be cost effective. The cheaper it is, the more likely I'm going to get money. So if I go and say I want $5 million to do an archaeological project, they're going to laugh. There's no way I'm going to get $5 million. So I have to break the projects up into multi-year projects. And the other reason why they get broken up is because I sit there and say we're going to be done in a field season, and 4 field seasons later, we're still at the same site because of what we found. Okay. So we're the only base that does this in all the DoD. There's no other military base that's doing a similar C-Camp. So we're in. And I'm hoping more bases get interested and want to do it by seeing how cost effective it is and the benefits. Because we do science and compliance, where CRM is compliance, right? You want to do science, but you're restricted by the money. You're there to get with the goal of, yes or no, there's a site there. Yes or no, it's National Register eligible. And what do we need to do with the site? And move on. Okay, next slide. What is C-Camp? Well, it's a low-cost archaeological training for UCF students. It's basically an archaeological field school. We have students who have never, ever seen an archaeological site before, except on TV, have never set foot on an archaeological site. I don't think some of them have even seen a shovel before in real life. Okay? And it's travel-free. UCF is really somewhat of a commuter campus, and a lot of the students there either are single moms, they can't travel. There may be medical reasons why they can't go and participate in a field school. They can't go off somewhere for weeks to go to a field school. So we're an alternative for those students who would miss out. Because one thing I am all about is inclusion, and that relates to the Archaeologist for Autism. But I want to make sure everybody gets the opportunity. And it's low-cost cultural resource management for us, because we're paying for the analysis. The students are signing up and paying to take an archaeological field school for credit. And obviously, it's a collaboration between UCF and Space Force. And again, 3 credit hours. And what they're doing is, and I harp on them all the time, is you're doing compliance archaeology, just like you're going to do if you go to work for a CRM firm. I tell them all the time, what you're learning at C Camp, yeah, it's helping Space Force, it's helping me. I'm a one-man show. I can't do this by myself. But you're also getting the training you need to get a job in cultural resource management. Next slide. And so we go 2 days a week, and they have assignments. Every student has to keep a notebook. And I review that notebook. And I'm saying, I'm form driven. Almost everything I do out in the field has a form associated with it, whether it be a level form, a shell test form. That's one of the things I stole or borrowed from Windover, was being form generated, have forms, because I have students who've never been out there before, and I want to make sure all the data is captured. And they also have to keep a notebook. Crew chiefs keep a notebook. And I treat it like it's a job. I expect you to be, I look at those students and say, you're an archaeology field technician. You're supposed to be here 2 days a week. You need to work. And if you don't want to, you really don't need to be here. UCF sponsors a research public day where they do posters. So the students have to do a poster on the project that they're working on, the site they're working on, for UCF. And they can win a $500 award. And then the same posters we turn around and recycle for a public outreach day, and they use it at FAS, or Southeastern Archaeological Conference. Okay, a lot of the work we do is another part of CCAMP, but it's not part of CCAMP. Is high definition 3D laser scanning being done by Lauren Collins and Travis Doran. So we sort of overlap and share data. For example, like on the cemeteries, they went and did ground penetrating radar at the cemeteries, but when I talk about the Penny site later, it looked like there was 1 grave, but there's actually 2, and we'll talk about that later. And so we share data, we overlap. They've been really good about helping the students. Next slide. All right, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Well, we're over in Brevard County on the other coast. We have over 100 previously recorded archaeological sites. We're actually finding more. We actually, a contractor found a site in a low probability area. It's not supposed to be there, but it's there. So there went my predictive model. Okay, we have 1 National Historic Landmark District. We have 253 National Register eligible properties, and we have 50 left to get all of the Cape done. So the last of those, I'm doing those as my schedule allows. And once we finish that, we'll have all the historic structures and infrastructure that's 50 years old or documented. Patrick, Space Force Base, where I also work at, and Jonathan Dickinson Missile Tracking Annex in Martin County, and Malabar Transmitter Annex are all properties that are owned by the Launch Delta. They've all been completely surveyed. So when they hadn't been surveyed when I got there, but so now they're done. So I'm just trying to finish up the Cape. Okay, next slide. We have over 6,000 years occupation. We just got some radiometric dates back, and we have some stone tools that date to the Middle Archaic, which was unexpected. We have the data from Glenn Dorn from FSU when they came out and we're doing coring and environmental reconstruction. I am bringing back some folks to do OSL dating of the soil to get some more dates on the soil when they were laid down, when they were on the ground surface. And at one of the sites on base, it's the oldest dune, the penny site's on the oldest dune ridge on the base. It's also contemporaneous with Windover. And when I worked at Windover, we actually found whelk shell tools in some of the graves. So I'm not saying they're related, I'm just saying they're contemporaneous. So 6,000 years ago, back when the Windover folks lived in Windover, the penny site was the beach. We have fishing camps, there was blockade running going on, Spanish interaction, etc. Next slide. The Indian River Cultural Area, or the Malabar Cultural Area, is located, as you can see, includes Brevard, Indian River, St. Lucie counties, and it ends at the north at the north end of Indian River Lagoon. It's contemporaneous with the St. John's, except that Czech stamp pottery doesn't seem to be as interesting to them prehistorically than to the north. So you see less Czech stamp pottery in this area, more sand tempered pottery. It's poorly understood. Back in the 50s, Goggin and Rouse and others all said, oh, it's not an interesting area. So we are the only ones actually doing research archaeology in the Indian River Cultural Area right now. We're it. Okay, next slide. Historic settlements, we got the lighthouse, which was moved a mile inland from its original location. The one we have now is an iron lighthouse that's brick lined. The original one was brick that was built in the 1840s. Like I said, fish camps, fish piers. You can see this homemade map that somebody did of all the homesteads that were on the base. And actually we compared those and actually relocated. We could say Burnham lived here. Wilson lived here. That's one of the advantages of doing the archaeology, the historic data. There's a lot of it out there. You just got to find it. So we actually have sites that we know who lived there historically. Next slide. Launch complexes, like I said, the Cape wasn't built to put people in space. It was research and development. Like, for example, this is the very first American satellite that was being launched into space, Explorer, after we got beat by the Russians with Sputnik. This recreates a launch tube in a submarine. All the submarine launched ballistic missiles that the Navy had used was developed here at the Cape. And that would rock back and forth and simulate a submarine's movement for launching. And the No-Go Navajo program. We also had the SNARK program. I don't have it up there, but there was so much competition between the two groups that were working out there, the SNARK people and the Navajo. The SNARK people would call the Navajo the No-Go Navajo because it blew up a lot. And then they also said the SNARK people, they would say that the waters off the Cape were snark-infested waters because so many of them went down in the ocean. And then, let's see, the bumper, that's one of the sites we're just worked on at the end of the season. We're going to be back next season. That's the very first launch from the Cape. It's actually a captured Nazi V-2 rocket that was converted over, and they called them bumpers because they would bump the satellite when they launched. And also for PR purposes, with so many veterans coming back from World War II, what do you think the response would be that they had Nazi SS personnel working on the space program with Nazi-built space vehicles? Okay, next slide. Man in space. when NASA put people up into space. That's our National Historic Landmark District. It's discontinuous. There's the museum right here. This is where it all started after Bumper. Launch Complex 5-6 is owned by NASA. 26 is this part. It's owned by us. It began as Mercury, Jupiter, Redstone programs. So Project Mercury was the first. It was a Redstone rocket, ICBM, and then changed to an Atlas ICBM. And you had your little capsule and you had your astronaut in there and you just lit the Roman candle and watched them go up. Then we switched to the 2 astronaut program, working our way to Apollo, and then 34, which was the early days of Apollo. And that is where the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts were killed on the pad in an incident. Next slide. Okay, why CCAN? Well, the DoD mandates to engage the public and our cultural resources, public archaeology. Compliance with the regs, like I said, support the mission. There was a lot of issues with the previous investigations of the archaeology that was done on the base. And we'll get into that in a minute. And it's just, a lot of it has to do with the environment where you're working. I tell any consultant that wants to come on base and work, do not come out in the summer. Because it is literally hell on earth out there. We're trying to do work. And I seem to recall when I worked for ACI, we always went up there in the summer. But climate change, physically prudent, win-win for all. Next slide. Our goals is intensive documentation, as I said. We want to correct a violation. We cannot save these sites, so let's document and fix issues with the previous documentation. Historic properties are being, with the laser scanning being documented. And the estimated completion date is 2030. And if I live long enough, 2035. Next slide. And also one of the things we have to be cognizant of, this is an active military base. It is evolving, it is changing. So we have buildings that are being demolished because of the long-term development plan. We have reuse areas. They're changing the way the campus looks. They're moving around like an admin area and move everybody from here, from the industrial area, because we're going to be launching launch vehicles all the way down here. And some of these, if there's a mishap, you don't need people in the industrial area and you don't want to have to evacuate people in the industrial area every time there's launch. And then we have constraints. We have what's called QD arcs. That's the radius that an explosion could happen, you know, the worst case scenario. And you can't have people in active facilities inside the QD arcs. So that's part of the restrictions. Plus we have the airfield there, the skid strip. So there's things that are stopping us from where we can build. So we go back to recently, the Space Force reactivated all the historic launch pads for customers to use instead of trying to build new. Next slide. Climate change. Everybody talks about the weather, but you can't do anything about it, right? So you can see some of our flooding just from tropical storms. And so we're talking about the nor'easter come in. This is Patrick. You can see how it's flooded. And this is at Launch Complex 19. The launch area is flooded. So next slide. And what's working against us is our topography. The cape is flat as a pancake. Okay. Next slide. So you can see here, the prediction is the cape's going to be underwater 25, 50 years. All right. So that's, again, why we're doing what we're doing. Next slide. And right here in red is where the worst erosion is occurring. That's right here on Missile Row and ICBM Row, where most of the historic launch complexes are. So most of the 3 men in space launch complexes, 14, 19, 34, are right there. Next slide. And here, I'll show you what the erosion is doing to our beaches. There is an ATV for scale. That's how much sand got removed from one hurricane event. This here is adjacent to Launch Complex 14. That is taller than I am for scale. So when you think about that, I'm 6'2", and that had to be like 7 foot. And you can see Launch Complex 34. This is a facility that's eroding out into the beach, and that's part of our NHL. And then, but there's one positive to it, if you want to look at it through rose-colored glasses, is every time there's a storm event, coastal mangrove gets exposed. So the sand gets taken out, we get to see more and more of the fossil mangrove, which is about 10,000 years old plus. So we run out, we photograph it, we GPS it, and within a week or two, it's gone. It's buried again. Next slide. Previous fieldwork deficiencies. Did not adequately test the sites because there was the contracts were limited in scope. We're putting in a power line corridor. You stay within the power line corridor, right? And you can't test where you can't access. When the vegetation is so bad, you can't access it, you can't test. And again, CRM is in nature not research oriented. And what they're involved in is ID sites and boundaries, will there be impacts? Like I said, Brazilian pepper, the bane of every archaeologist in Florida. I know one consultant came out back in 2008, and they looked at these maps called BIGS, and they saw this white, and they thought it was clear to vegetation, and it was solid Brazilian pepper, and they had to get on their hands and knees and crawl, and they dragged the tape. And when they got to the shovel test location, they cleared an area and they dug. And that's how they did the phase 1 archaeology on one site. And they were working 13-hour days. And I didn't laugh at it or anything, or be that for me, right? The information lost or missing. We had people that did not have a background in cultural resources. Some things got thrown out. Some notes got thrown out. Some notes are missing. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the things is there was a lot of data that wasn't available to archaeologists until like 2006, 2008. It was all paper formatted and buried somewhere in offices. Like a lot of it was in the real property office. So like BIGs and master plans, they're now all scanned in. So now if I need to do research or if somebody wants to do archaeology, they can come to me and I can provide them with everything electronically. None of that stuff was available. And actually some of the information for some reason was on Kennedy Space Center and not on the Cape. So it was completely unavailable. But of course there was no GPS or GIS back in the day, right? Cold War sites, no one cared because they weren't 50 years or older. Large areas were not tested at all. And we've had some artifact collections that are lost. Next slide. Okay. The DHR standards weren't met. There was some folks that didn't have experience that were my predecessors. There was a whole bunch of reports that were never submitted to SHPO, as I found out the hard way when I contacted SHPO. And then the cemeteries were neglected, and not neglected, so to speak, but the vegetation was mowed, and they were kept that in that way, but like no cleaning headstones or grave markers, right? And so they were usually cleaning up the area of the site, any debris or anything for Descendants Day. And then we had a program quarterly to mow and do vegetation abatement. And part of C Camp is I make them go back and clean the markers, whether they need them or not, so they get the training. Next slide. Invasive species, like I mentioned, back in the day, before I arrived, you didn't get controlled burns, herbicide treatment, or mechanical treatment to open transects for you to do digging. So there's sites that were never tested because it was impossible to get into the site to test. Next slide. And then I piggyback on their program too. So after they do a controlled burn, well, I used to go out and walk the sites. and look for surface collections. You would not believe how many missile crash sites there are on that base. Or missile debris. Okay, basic information guides or BIGs, like I was mentioning, that's a book of maps that lists every facility, the year they were constructed, and what they were used for. As-built is actually blueprints. Okay, we got all the real estate maps, and then aerial photographs. For example, Pier Road was a whole series of these houses, Mediterranean revival houses. Well, the Air Force came in and used a lot of the buildings for a few years, and since this was a building that was inducted into the real property records, it has, you can't really see, but it has a facility number and a description. They're gone, but we were able to find, or USF was able to find all the house sites. And then aerial photographs, you'd be amazed when you get the 1943 or 1920 aerial photographs and start looking at what was on the Cape. It's been an eye-opener. But all these now are available electronically. Next slide. So, mitigation through documentation. I can't say that enough. We're going to do our best to do a comprehensive report that'll be acceptable to all players and regulators. Next slide. So, I got this research questions from the ACI report. Again, from 1999, I think it was, when you did the phase 2 of 16 sites. But I adopted their research questions for the Cape. Okay, so how old are the sites? What are the boundaries? So you can see right here who lived there. So again, we're doing compliance, but this is the science part right here. Okay, next slide. And again, we want to understand seasonality, exchange connections, were there any? What did the people, what impacts did they have over time? Like Stinktown is a site out there where they were doing fish harvesting. So they decimated the shark population off the coast, early 1900s. And how did the transition to the European period take place? Next slide. And so, C-Camp learning, this is what the students get. Exposure to regulations, training with hardware, software, data analysis, public communication. A lot of them are scared to go out in front of the public. So I make them, I browbeat them and I guilt them until they do it. And they get so tired of hearing me talk about it, they'll do, okay, Tom, I'm going to do it. And then alternative survey methods. We've had cadaver dogs from the county come out with really good success. Thermal imagery cameras, not so much. It's a trick to using the FLIR thermal imagery cameras. Yes, they are good for locating burials, but you got to make sure the ground doesn't have any trees. It's an open field. Okay. But that's that's an aside. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. So they start by going to the blockhouse of 14, which has been turned into an education center and conference center. And then they get the tour of the sites. I take them to all the sites so they can learn about the launch programs, and the kids had no idea. I keep forgetting that they weren't even, their parents weren't even born in some cases with these different launch vehicles. So I have to explain to them about it. And we do aerospace archaeology on the base. So they need to know. And then, of course, they tour the lighthouse, the cemeteries. We have a missile collection in one of the historic hangars. Next slide. And then again, GPS, 3D scanning, flotation. You can see the Cape Lighthouse in the background. And then GPR, photogrammetry, and other technologies. Next one. So, I tried all these kids, you know how the kids are today, they're all with their phones, right? I tell them, what happens if your technology fails and you're in Belize or Honduras or Guatemala? What happens if that GPS unit doesn't start working? Well, you need to know old school methods. So I tell them about the blue line aerials. Remember those blue aerial photographs, one drop of sweat, the ink runs. And going out there and drawing a site, showing where a site is, and then the place looks totally different 2 years later when you go back and do phase two. So I have them do everything old school. So before they're allowed to touch a GPS unit or a pop control station, this is what they need to learn. And again, I always say, well, technology is great, but what if it fails? Next slide. Field methods. Okay, phase one archaeological survey. We split the site up. We do some phase one, part of the phase one survey, but we do phase two where we did the phase one. That way, every student, I don't usually do the phase one completely, do the shovel testing to determine where everything on the site is. Then you go back and do phase two. But I want the students to learn how to do test units. So I want them to leave C-Camp with all the skills to do testing, survey testing, and excavation. And then for years, Julie the archaeologist was one of my supervisors out there. So there he is, keeping a watch on him, and there you can see he's really interested in what they're doing. He did that most of the time. Except once he climbed in a unit with me, but that didn't go so well. So go ahead, next slide. Then phase two, you can see, we'll talk about a little bit, but there's two graves superimposed right there, historic graves. The big hunt for Nathan Penny when he was missing. When it turned out he wasn't missing, he was there the whole time. I'll get to that a little bit. But you can see the excavation work. These are archaeological features. This is a big shell feature. So I have them out there learning dig at 10 centimeter levels. You got line levels out there. And again, notes, and paperwork. Next slide. And again, I had them, USF did 3D laser scanning, but I also had the students out there cleaning I taught them methods for cleaning all of the headstones. And then I had them do research and everything on the cemeteries. And it was overlapping with USF, but I wanted them to get experience on documenting and cleaning historic cemeteries and why they're important. And these are all local homesteader graves. There's no military graves out there. And also, I like them cleaned up for Descendants Day. When all the descendants of the original inhabitants come out there, they've been really happy to see how their ancestors, their grandparents, or great aunts, great uncles, or whatever, how good their graves look. And then I'm working on a project to get the ones that are broken, stabilized, and fixed up. Okay, next slide. And then again, we did metal detector surveys, soil probing, the cadaver dog, and I used the thermal imaging camera with not much success. But all the other methods, we put together maps, compared it to GPR. Next slide. And then, like I mentioned, the manpower is free. So this is where we take our money and use our money. Radiometric dating, stable isotopes of shell, residue and biolith analysis of ceramics, faunal analysis, NAA. It's called instrumental neutron activation analysis of the sherds to tell us where the clay came from, lithic analysis, rupture analysis, and so on and so forth. And so they work in the lab with me, and part of their grade is they have a project every year, and they have to submit something that will later be used in the reports. So they're learning to write for a report. Next slide. The sites. Now we get into talking about the fun stuff, the archaeology that's been done. Okay, we've done the bird site, which we have to go back to, the old lighthouse site, hotel site, Quarterman site, penny plot. And then this past year, we just added the bumper missile blockhouse site, which I'll get to. So next slide. Burn site, go ahead, next slide. When you come to the burn site, It's fenced in, and there's a burial mound in there. To work with the tribes, we created a repatriation mound that's above ground, made out of a big donut. They could put human remains in, put them in there, and we fill in, so on and so forth. Each time they have a tournament. The reason why we just didn't bury it in the ground is from years of impacts to the mound. There's human remains swarmed all inside the fenced area and partially outside. So during repatriation action, we didn't want more human remains to be exposed. So I created this artificial mound that can be used. And we have enough soil stockpile, we can create more mounds if we need to. And this is the site. Burn site is named after the last occupant, but it was actually the homestead of Mills O'Burnham, who was the first Anglo settler on the Cape and the first permanent lighthouse keeper. The other two lighthouse keepers took off because they were afraid they were going to be attacked by the Seminoles. So they just abandoned the site. And then at the north end of the property is the Wilson brothers. The Wilsons were the first assistant keepers out there, so they lived north of Burnham. So it's all big one site. Next slide. Previous research in 1935 by Sterling found this silver artifact. This is the only known picture of the mound, and it was deflated back even then. And if you notice, this is all sand, and then midden was added on top. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. Here's all the surveys that were done. Changes in site boundaries. Of course, a lot of this was before GPS. It was just based on what you saw in the field and what was found in the shovel tests. Next slide. We also found one of the things that going through the old digs, etc., that was missed is things like this. At one time, the burn site was a missile graveyard. So what they would do is they would bring missiles that weren't working or were defective, and they would put them on a trailer, and they would bring them out to these locations and just leave, abandon them. In one case, at one of the old landfills, they dug pits, backed the trucks in, slid the missiles in, pulled them out, and then buried the missiles. Whole, complete in the landfill. We still don't know if it was actually used or not. My theory is that they did this, they made this missile graveyard, and then realized there was cemeteries there and a mound, and then moved it. And so this doesn't officially exist because it doesn't have a facility number. But there's a lot of sites on base that don't have facility numbers that exist for various reasons. All right, next slide. Here's some of the artifacts that we found in the past 7 years: a historic clay pipe, greenstone nodule. We have olive jar, and it's the first olive jar I've seen since I worked at St. Augustine in my field school in 1984. A lot of modified sandstone, unusual ceramics that are atypical. We actually had 4,000 sherds in one 30-centimeter thick deposit. And another one we had over 1,000. And that was near the burial mound. We think it was a special use area. Next slide. Okay, we did the first topographic map of the mound. We have evidence of contact with Europeans. The dates were really a surprise. For AD 1400, Mississippian period. We had a high occurrence of decorated pottery. I have seen more checks stamped on that site than I have in any other site in the area. Especially when you go inland, you see a lot less. The fauna was a diverse range. We confirmed it was natural register eligible, and you can see when it was occupied and special use ceremonial area next to the map. Next slide. We got good data on the shellfish exploitation. They were eating a lot of donax or coquina, and also used a lot of whelks. Next slide. And the big shocker. In some of the sherds that date to the Mississippian period, a couple of the historic period, we have corn, beans, and squash residue found inside the sherds. And we have good contacts. How did it get there? Is it only next to the mound? Well, so we're going back this year and taking some additional test units to see, is it just located next to the mound, which says that it was there for special use? How did it get there? They weren't growing corn, beans, and squash that we know of. In my mind, it had to be imported, but that's something that we need to do further research on. And Neil Duncan, the ethnobotanist, is the one that pulled the residues off, and he'll be given a poster at SEAC in October. Okay, and he's working on a paper to be published on this. I didn't believe it at first. I was in denial because I said it can't happen. Just like one of my students is constantly correcting me about ceramics because I'm like, no, this ceramic type is never found here. And then she tells me no. She's looking at it with fresh eyes. She's not old and jaded like me. So she corrects me, and I told her she's always apologizing. I say, no, just keep correcting me. All right, next slide. So what we do know is this is a sand mound. I think this is all redeposited midden. The burials were buried in a spoke fashion with their heads all pointed to the interior. There's one other site in Brevard County, and I know George Lohr and Mary Albee worked on the spoke pattern, but we have this site here that was buried there. What I'm thinking is it's late, it's historic period. They laid the bodies out and they mined the midden from the occupation and used it to quickly bury the bodies. That's my theory, but we don't have any proof positive yet. This is the ceremonial area where the corn, beans, and squash. You can see it's right next to the mound. So, next slide. One of the things I did was I used the thermal imagery camera on the mound, and you see these anomalies. So I think there's some intact burials that weren't excavated out by Sterling and others. But given the questionable results from the FLIR, I'm a doubting Thomas. But who knows? Next slide. And again, the radial burials. Mary, you ought to recognize this. They did. George Lohr and Mary Albee did a lot of work on spoke patterns. One of my students is actually doing more work on it to find out more information about spoke burials. But as you can see, it's almost all coastal sites. There's 2 sites in Brevard County with spoke burials, actually 3. And there maybe have been some other ones that C.B. Moore talked about. All right, next slide. So, we recognize we identify where all the human remains are located. There's no graves outside the fence line of the 2 historic cemeteries. We withdrew the site boundaries, and we developed a plan to stabilize the mound, control erosion, and gopher tortoises. A real problem, disinterred human remains. So I'm out there at least 4 times a year picking up human remains and reburying them because the gopher tortoises. So what we've been doing to stop that has been trapping them, bucket trapping them, and relocating them. All right, next slide. So we want to know if there's a domestic area versus special use or ceremonial. We admit that there's disturbances to the site. And again, we're going to do more research on the finalists. Next slide. And as much as I wanted to say after 4 years that this was done, actually 7 years, we're going to go back because of the results of the bean, squash, and maize, and because of the ceramic clusters from these heat maps and with fauna. So we're going to go back and pick these selected areas to do test units and then see if there's any comparison or contrast to the special use area that was there. Next slide. And again, we're going to test based on the heat maps. All right, next slide. The old lighthouse site. This was full of surprises. The original lighthouse was this brick one. It was built in the 1840s. And then in 1868, this iron lighthouse with brick interior was constructed. And it was there, they were there concurrently for many years. Then in the 1893-94 Years, this lighthouse was taken down and moved a mile inland. Okay, next slide. There wasn't a lot of testing done. But we went back, next slide, and the previous investigations, especially the one that was done by Corps engineers, was concentrating on trying to locate the wall of the original lighthouse. And they didn't do any shovel testing that I know of. They just did backhoe archaeology. Next slide. They did find the wall, but during historic research, we found that it was probably used during World War II. We found that it was used as a camera site for launches in the 50s, 60s. It was also a mobile launch site for the Lark and Matador missiles. And there was a building on there that was used for in support of launches at 43 and 46. All right, next slide. So here you see some photographs of the original lighthouses that we have on file. When the Air Force took over, they actually went back and took the 1873 drawings and redrew them because they were going to use them for facilities. So we have floor plans of what the inside looked like. And the Lighthouse Foundation has been using these to reconstruct the keepers' cottages. And they have tours now of the lighthouse. Okay, next slide. Here's the wall exposed in 2020. There was some debate whether it was 1840s or 1860s, 1890s, but we finally all agreed that it was 1840s wall. What they did was they blew up the original lighthouse and used the brick for the new lighthouse site. Back in the 1890s. And here's a 3D scan by USF showing the wall. And the 3D laser scanning was done because we had a hurricane that took out 75 meters of beach and came right up to the edge of this. And so they were going to build a wall to protect Launch Complex 46, which was nearby. So I didn't want to damage, and I saw what was coming with the erosion, so we opened it up, did some more backfill archaeology, 3D scan. Next slide. Now you can see there's a 3D, there is the 1868 to the 1893 Lighthouse Foundation. It's still in existence, sitting right there on the surface. Here's another, there's sections of it made of granite. We have the drawings for it. And here's a 3D scan. And one aside was we went and restored the lamp room to the lighthouse that it's at the 1868 lighthouse. Well, we had the plans, but what happened was each one of those iron pieces was done back in the day. They were individually cast. So what happened was when they tried to restore it and put everything back together again, the pieces wouldn't fit. So they had to order new pieces and adjust them. And so they had to take each individual original one so a mold could be made so they could actually put it together so it would fit together. All right, next slide. So here's what we did with CCAN. You can see the difference in the number of shovel tests that were done. I think if we put any more holes in there, the cake would have sunk. All right, so next slide. And here's some of the artifacts we found. We found an 1840s lighthouse step, a bracket, wagon part, found coal from the stoves. We found the leg. And one of the things I love is the old Sears catalogs and Montgomery Ward. So we took the leg and compared it to the old reprints of the catalog and found out that it matched that stove leg. Next slide. And then here's some more. We've got stoneware, whiteware, got slag. We don't know where that came from. Bottles and jars. Next slide. One of the things that was a mystery was the 1849 USGS map says there's a water tank and a launch tower there, but nobody knew what it was and no one tried to identify it. 1943 aerial photographs showed the building there. Well, what was it? Well, no one knew. None of the previous surveys addressed it. So I have a great group of people that I can go to who are descendants, part of the Lighthouse Foundation, Everybody's real helpful, plus they contacted the Navy and the Coast Guard. Turns out it was a Coast Watch station. We didn't find any evidence of it archaeologically, but historically you can see the tower right there. And some of the descendants of these folks here, you can see the tower in the background, were out at the lighthouse where the family used to live in the 1840s through 1890s. And so we figured out, I contacted the Coast Guard and the Navy. So it turns out to be a Coast Guard, Coast Watch for U-boats. And like I said, unfortunately, we couldn't find any evidence of it or the building that was there. And it's logical because at that time, the Coast Guard was operating the lighthouse. Originally, it was operated by families. In the 30s, the Coast Guard took over all lighthouse activities. Next slide. And again, using those bigs that weren't available previously, we found out that it was more than a lighthouse site. It was used for tracking cameras. So all the base was covered with these tracking things. So you can see the evolution of radar and tracking systems out at the Cape during the different missile programs. What happened was they had these different camera sites out at the tip, and this whole area was called launch area. And for years, nobody knew what launch area meant or where it was. Well, by going back and doing some research, we found out that, yeah, the tip of the Cape was launch area for mobile launchers. And then, again, we found out that it was being used to launch larks and matadors. And you can actually see the different facilities on aerial photographs on this slide. And you can see right here, we have a picture of the bunker that was out there for launching missiles. You see these two poles. Those are targeting poles for this camera. You can see the poles back there. Here we go. We have the as-builts, and we couldn't photograph it because the vegetation is so dense. But we found where somebody sometimes took a chainsaw and cut the targeting poles down, sometime back, who knows when, and they're out there at the site. So now we know it was used during World War II. It was used for tracking systems and launches. Next slide, please. And again, you can see here, camera pad, pad C bunker, camera pad. Again, a bunker, a pad C, transformer vault. So this is from when it was used as a Matador missile launch complex. Next slide. And here's one of the missiles that was launched there, the Lark. The Lark was actually being developed by the U.S. Navy for shooting down kamikaze planes in World War II, but the war ended too soon. So they turned it into using it as a missile for shooting down other missiles and aircraft. And so these are actual pictures, the previous one and this are actual pictures from there at the lighthouse site. So what's great is you go to the archives, you can take the information and find out where this photograph was taken so you can see the activity that was going on out there, 1950 plus. Okay, here's the Matador missile, again, launched from out there. You can see there's target poles right there. You can see the blockhouse back there, which is a temporary blockhouse. And so I have dozens of photographs in black and white color of the launches from out there. Next slide. And another great thing about working out there is we actually have the missiles. So I can take a piece and go to the collection and look at the piece that's found out in the field and say it's from this missile. Next slide. And we have schematics too. And there's the blockhouse, and there's the foundation of the blockhouse when we redid the survey that was found. Next slide. And we found these artifacts that date to the U.S. Air Force. And this light bulb here, I actually was able to, there was one photo from the 50s that was so high quality, I zoomed in and I could actually see the light bulb in the light socket out there that matched this bulb. Next slide. Here's an interesting part where my job working safety and launch support came in. This was originally thought to be part of the lighthouse. Obviously, that's too young to be part of the lighthouse. So, being that I used to work launch support, see these numbers right here?
Those are QA, QC stamps used by the engineers when they're assembling a missile or they're getting ready to launch. So as soon as I saw those stamps, the space shuttle and all of like SpaceX, they have the same thing. They have these different numbers. So whenever they're doing a process of working on a missile, as they do each process, they stamp. What they call working the paper or working the book. So they stamp the book, stamp the part. And this part came from right there, from right where that piece, that booster attaches. And luckily, I found some Matador folks in the museum, the Air Force Space and Missile Museum, found some folks who worked on the Matador program, and we were able to talk about it, and that's when we figured that it is. Next slide. And of course, they had this historic structure, was a transformer vault that's even being used to this day. That was underwater during the, I think it was Irma. Okay, next slide. And the site, we determined the site is significantly smaller. The photograph that was originally done, the historic photograph that was acquired in 2006, the person that did the archaeological report had the picture backwards. So it shows the houses and buildings all within Launch Complex 46, current Launch Complex 46, but it turns out it wasn't. It was backwards. There's no traces of cisterns, trash pits, or privy pits because in 1972, the Air Force came in and cleared it flat as a pancake. In fact, they did the same thing at the new lighthouse site back in the 60s. So when we were doing contaminated soil cleanup and doing backward archaeology out there, we found all the cisterns and brick piers for the houses, but it was like chopped when they demolished it because they didn't mess around. When they tore something down, they didn't play around. Okay. Next slide. The hotel site. This is a site that was called the Casino back in the day. My mother's lived in Titusville forever, my mother-in-law, and she knows a lot of the old timers, and supposedly there was a lot of rum running going on here during Prohibition. And when we did the archaeology, we found a lot of bottles with Spanish embossing on it. So I'm pretty sure that's what was going on. It was called a casino back in the day, which basically was a restaurant and a dance hall. Okay, next slide. And here again, previous survey. It was divided into two sites, a prehistoric site and a historic site. And they didn't know why back in the day, but we do now. Next slide. Here's some photographs again. You know, I have a lot of help from interested parties, Air Force Museum and the Lighthouse Foundation, etc. And we got newspaper articles. One student went through the year that we were working on this project, went through every newspaper in Titusville that was archived. And went and looked for anything that said casino, the name of the hotel, everything for his project. So we have a complete chronology of this site from newspaper articles and magazine articles. And you can see there was a pier there, and there's the casino right here. And they may have been used as a fish camp as well. And here's a good photograph, a postcard. And I got to thank the students for finding those and the newspaper articles. Okay. And when the Air Force took over, they used it for a cafeteria for a period of time. And that's why I think the Midden got on site. I think they needed a parking lot, so they just borrowed some Midden from down the road. And I know which Midden they borrowed because everybody borrowed from that Midden in the 1950s and 60s. Okay. And so there's all the work that we did. You know, 25-meter interval testing was closer interval testing. You know, one of the things I taught them was how to look for ornamentals and non-native plants to find archaeological sites. Something they never would have considered. And one of the things I do is whenever we go on a site, why is this a site? How do we know that this is an archaeological site? And usually it's because somebody did a survey here and found it. And I go, no, if you were walking on the site, how do you know it's a site? And then a lot of times I find in the notes, I see Tom said so. All right, because there was yucca plants and everything out there. Okay, next slide. Right, here we go. And again, what we found a lot of evidence too of the military use of it. We found Marston matting. If you don't know what that is, that was used during World War II by the Navy Seabees, especially the South Pacific when they were building airfields like the Guadalcanal. Yeah, they would use the crushed up shell, but they would bring these metal segments called Marston matting and lay those down to interconnect. And it was used a lot out there. You'll go on, I'll do a recon, or used to do recon surveys out in the middle of nowhere and find a piece of it. It's like, why is it there? Just like pieces of missile. And then there's again another one set of those targeting poles. There's the yucca with the foundation. We actually found a winch for reeling in nets from the pier that was there nearby. And then a lot of surface scatter. There's an antenna pad. That report is currently being worked on. Next slide. So we found out that in addition to the early history of historic use of it, and at one time during the boom period, you saw that 1928 house I showed you on Pier Road. Well, originally, that's some of the houses right there. The original plan during the boom era in the 1920s was to dig the Canaveral Harbor, which is further south, right here along this road and then here. So this was supposed to be a real big development, and they were going to have a train run over from Orlando that went all the way out to here. And it was going to be called Canaveral Harbor. But then the stock market crashed, and that ended that. And then what happened was, in the 1950s, the casino was used as a mess hall, and you see this motor pool, it says motor pool. That's how I think the Midden got brought there. So they had their vehicles, Air Force vehicles stashed there and are parked there. And so they needed to stabilize the ground, so they brought Midden in. And that same Midden was mined and taken to the lighthouse, the current lighthouse site, including the human remains that were in it, and created an prehistoric archaeological site in front of the lighthouse, including human remains. And it didn't exist before the 1950s until it got mined. And that happened a lot out there. Next slide, please. Quartermen. We can go through this pretty fast. It turned out not to be national register eligible after we worked on it. When it was determined to be national register eligible, there's really nothing left. Go ahead, next slide. It was associated with the Quartermans, the Quarterman family. They were lighthouse keepers, assistant lighthouse keepers, and also one of them ran the house of refuge that was on Kennedy Space Center that back in the day we looked for and we couldn't find, or we actually found that most of it was gone. So actually the Quartermans moved to the Cape and then moved up. One of them moved up with one family to run the house of refuge, Chester Shoals on Kennedy Space Center property. So there's a lot of overlap between, and one of the things is there was a lot of intermarriage. So everybody's related to everybody. And George, you can see, and Anna Dummett Burnham. And the reason why Dummett's important is Douglas Dummett invented Indian River citrus by grafting citrus plants. And so he's the inventor of it. And all the citrus stock in Brevard County was purchased from him or indirectly from another party from him. And interesting about Douglas Dummett was he lived up north of Kennedy Space Center, but he actually married someone of mixed race, which was illegal back in the day. And I think that's one of the reasons why he moved from Volusia and East Smyrna down to where he did, because he had to Dummett Cove, because there was nobody there to say anything about who his wife was and what her race was. All right. Next slide. Okay, again, here's all the surveys that were done. And as you can see, again, you see how the boundaries change, but that's what happens when you don't have GPS, GIS, and you can't get into the interior of interior to actually adequately survey. Next slide. Okay, here we did, actually before Sea Camp, I had students come out and help me because it's on a one-man show. We did some, and that was for a compliance for some power line corridors. We found a canal. We removed these wooden markers and put in stone markers. We found there was a tracking facility there. There's tracking facilities everywhere. You couldn't throw throw a rock without hitting a tracking facility out there. And we found the original security forces building was out there. Next slide. And so there's the actual foundation you see from the road of the facility. And again, that's how the bigs and the master plan maps work. Okay. Next slide. Yeah, Penny site.
We're gonna have to wrap up. They're gonna close the library.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, this site's been pretty interesting. We started working at the site. We were supposed to work one season, and then when the ground penetrating radar showed one grade, we decided to do all this testing to find two. Try to find Nathan Penny. So the big question was, where's Nathan Penny? So what happened was, after we started excavating, we found that Nathan Penny was buried on top of Maria Penny. And we found what was unexpected. We found a lot of prehistoric material that was ever found out there before, including a special use area. If you want to go ahead and go through some of the slides here. Next. Okay, there you go. There you can see right there, there's Maria and there's Nathan on top of each other. And there's the GPR analysis, but that's what the dirt archaeology told us. Next slide. Next slide. And then some of the artifacts, we were finding archaic period points. The students are so good, they find fish scales and seeds. Atypical sherds, we find pumice. It washes up on the beach, gets caught up in the Gulf Stream. But one thing we found that I never saw before, I thought it was a piece of meteor. This is scoria. This is volcanic rock. It doesn't float like pumice. It had to be traded up here. Where it was traded from was probably from South Florida and from the Caribbean. Next slide. And again, a sherd with a finger impression, seeds, typical recovery shell tools. Next slide. Bone points, more artifacts. Go ahead, continue on. Bone pins, plummets, agatized coral that was polished. They left the exterior on it and polished it. Next slide. And there's the mound that was 12 feet tall. That was found when they cut a transect for shovel testing. That was previously unrecorded. It's about 12 feet tall. Next slide. So you can see here is some of the results right now. And we're finishing up this season. And we may have actually found, I just found out maize remains on sherds from this side as well. Next slide. Okay, so we have a special use area where they were processing clam shells, like having a little clam bake. All this is midden, and there's the mound. But this is different than your typical midden. There's no midden, but there's these little cluster piles of shells that you can see were broken open, and at least some of the shells match that one stone tool, the breakage. Next slide.
Oops.
And then we're working on the bumper site. That's the first launch. The blockhouse, it was a mystery where it was located at. We were told 4 different locations. You can see on this slide right here. And that's what it looked like back in the day. So we're trying to find this, and we found it this year. So we're going to go back and do excavation work there to try to find some more of the features, like the periscope or mirror prism that was used to watch the launches, the revetment, and the Marston matting walkway. So that's coming up this next field season. So it's part of the bigger 1 through 4 launch complex. I'm just going to scroll through real quick. One thing is public archaeology at the Sands History Center Museum. We have an open to the public event where all the students present their research on posters. And they also do conferences. Next slide. And that's what happens when you work for me on the last day, you just collapse. Okay, and also here's our success rate with the students. And next slide is the students and the professors. And I gotta say, oh yeah, there's Foley. And it's his 12th birthday today and his 10th anniversary of his gotcha days of our service dog. And these are all the players that are involved in the project. And I have to say, those students have been great. They've done everything I've asked for. They rarely complain, or at least they don't complain to me. I'm sure they're on their social media saying all kinds of things, but they're some of the hardest working kids I know, and they all want to be there. They all want to learn, and I'm happy. I'm very happy with them. A lot of them have gone on